All right, we'll get into John, the 18th chapter and verse 1. We had finished up last week with what we have sometimes referred to as the true Lord's Prayer, as he was praying there with his disciples in the upper room. John tells us that this prayer took place while they were still there in the upper room. And as we come into verse 18, or verse 1 of chapter 18, it says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Cedron, where was a garden into which he entered, and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oft times resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spake of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain and officers, the Jews, took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was he which had counseled the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. I'll kind of stop there and see how we do with that. John and the statements that we have here, this just sort of seems like a, casual little thing. But, if you look at Jerusalem and you look where he ends up, which is the Mount of Olives, when we get there and look at that, we realize that this is kind of a hike. Wherever they were in the city of Jerusalem, which is referred to as the upper room, they had to come down out of the upper room, walk through the city of Jerusalem, go out the gate, and walk in the path down through the valley of Cedron, and then cross the stream to whatever extent it was present at that time. Then they had to climb the hill, and I'm sure everybody's seen a picture of the Temple Mount, and most of those pictures are taken from the Mount of Olives. And I don't know about you, but I really wouldn't prefer to hike up that hillside. I don't know whether they had at that time a curvy, windy road, or if they just went straight up the side of the hill. I don't know. Normally you kind of have a road that goes back and forth and all, but it's quite possible they had a trail up the hill. But as we look at that, it was a hike. So there was some time between when he finished his prayer and they went out and finally arrived at the Mount of Olives. Now, I don't know the exact measurement yard-wise or feet-wise for that. But again, like I say, you've seen pictures, it's a hike, so it took some time to get there. Now, the thing that happens here in the 18th chapter that we don't really see, and John doesn't really spend much time talking about it is the prayer that Jesus had in the Garden of Gethsemane. The interesting thing is the other writers talk about Jesus and praying in the garden, and he took the disciples up there, and he told them to wait there with him. Then he took Peter and James and John, and they went a little bit further, and he asked them to wait there, and then he went a little bit further himself. And we see the prayer that was prayed there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And as we see here, that's not taken into account. John chooses, the Holy Spirit chooses for John to write about the prayer and the events and things that were taking place in the upper room. And so he spends more time on that, while the other writers spend a lot of time talking about the Garden of Gethsemane and the prayer and Jesus praying, "Let this cup pass from me." But it's interesting that what John does speak of in verse 11, and I know we're kind of jumping ahead, but in verse 11 he speaks to Peter and says, "The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it?" And so even though we don't have the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed, "Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me," we don't have that prayer, but what we do have is that John does record the fact that the cup of sufferings and the things that Jesus was going to go through, he does mention that when he talks about Peter. And so he ties all of those things together with his gospel. And so Jesus and his disciples went over to the garden there in Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. There was an olive orchard there, and there was a olive press, a lot like a wine press, but rather than squeezing grapes to produce grape juice, that it would squeeze the olives to produce olive oil, which was a very important, again, natural resource at that time. It was used for cooking, it was used for light, it was used for medications, ointments. And so as a basic item, olive oil was a very prized thing. At that time, it was kind of in or around or about just about everything that was going on. And so this is a place when Jesus didn't want to be in the city. And we have to understand, Jesus didn't grow up in a big city. I've been to New York twice, and from my standpoint, that's 3 times too many. I don't like it. I don't like the bus fumes. I don't like the car fumes. I don't like the noise. It's constantly sirens and horns, and people there drive with their horn. I mean, they don't use signal lights. They just blow their horn and drive out in front of you. So, again, big cities have some rather unique aspects. Now, I'm sure Jerusalem didn't have buses and cars and all of that, but nonetheless, it's just people are piled in on top of each other. People are walking the streets. Animals are around. Dogs are barking, whatever. It's just completely different. And so it just seems to me that Jesus, he thought Jerusalem was okay to visit, but he really didn't want to live there. And even when he visited, it seems that he preferred the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. That was one of the places that he would go, which was close to Jerusalem. And if he wasn't going there, as the scriptures tell us here, he would go up to this place. He just didn't like to stay in the city. Now, I know there are some aspects when they specifically were looking for him and wanted to put him to death that he chose not to stay in the city until the appropriate time. But even before that, it seems that he had a habit of just going up and what they would think of just sort of camping out under the olive trees and under the stars. For Jesus, who was God in the flesh, I don't know what it was to be confined, pushed into a little space. It's confining enough to have been the God of creation and be confined to a physical form, and then to have that physical form confined to a closed-in space. It would just kind of seem to me to be a lot claustrophobic. And so it seems that he liked to be out and to have access to the stars and the heavens, which the psalmist said declare the glory of God. Lay there and to look at the stars and the planets and, all that was there. And he did this enough that even Judas knew if he wasn't in the upper room. Now, Judas had left earlier. As we recall, Jesus told him what he had to do or what he intended to do quickly. And so he departed and left. So we would probably make at least a short assumption, unless Jesus had already mentioned that they were going there. He may have looked first at the place of the upper room and then came there. We know Jesus and his disciples had enough time to journey there for Jesus to have his prayer and all the things that we see in the other writer's account, the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then Judas, verse 2 also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. And we've talked about this, but in Jerusalem and in some of the cities, but especially Jerusalem, because it had a large influx of people, especially at different times of the year, the three main times, and this is Passover, when Jesus is crucified. And so there's a lot of people there. And of course, most of the houses had an open roof area. And I kind of think of it as the porch. They didn't kind of hook the porch onto the front or the side or the back. It's just a sort of a flat roof. So, it has stairs up to the top, and we sit up there. Some of them had a little covering there to get out of the direct sun if it was during the day, or out of some of the odd and end weather that might come through. But people many times when they came to the feast and the celebration would stay there. They would go up there, and that for many was sort of like a guest room. Do you have anywhere that we could stay? And I go on upstairs, and they would go up to the roof. Well, that doesn't seem to be Jesus' cup of tea either. He doesn't, when he's there, he just likes to be out. And Judas knows this, that it's not occasionally, but it says oftentimes. It's a very often thing when Jesus is there that he's going to do that. And so Judas, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Now, we need to understand these are not Romans. These are not Roman soldiers that have been given to come and take Jesus. These are the Levites, primarily, part of the priestly family whose job it was to provide security for the temple. These are what we might refer to as temple guards. Now, I know here it talks about the fact that they are officers, but they're officers in the sense that they have a specific requirement or responsibility in providing security. These individuals were under the direction of the chief priest and the Sanhedrin council. And so having already worked out the deal with Judas, and they knew what they were going to do. They gave them a band of men and officers. And so they had the formal security, if you want to call it that, officers from the temple guard. And then they just got a bunch of other guys. Now, I don't know exactly how to describe them. It says here of men, and of men is in italics, as you see. They received a band and officers. So there were men acting on behalf of the Sanhedrin, following the orders of the Sanhedrin Council, and it was the temple officers' responsibility to enforce that. And so they're sent there to officially and formally take Jesus into custody. They're going to, and they don't know, Judas doesn't know, what's going to happen when they try to take Jesus. I mean, this is somebody who he has seen perform all kinds of miracles. And so Judas is not really sure. He doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. I'm sure he probably knew Peter. And if he knew Peter, he also knew Andrew and James and John and some of those. And I'm just, again, going by the advice I was given many years ago. But these men weren't sissies. One fisherman a long time ago, he made it clear to me that, these were crusty sailors. I mean, these were people who understood physical labor. They pulled the nets in by a handful of fishes. They were people who were very physical. And so the Sanhedrin made sure that they had officers who were armed, and they had a band of men, not just 2 or 3, but they had what they deemed, at least, to be sufficient, what they thought were sufficient. And so it says, they cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. So this is night. So if they came thither with lanterns and torches and all this, you think it was very stealthy? I mean, you can look, and there's not too many nighttime pictures of the Temple Mount, but you can imagine if there were a nice group of individuals walking out of the city of Jerusalem down through this valley and coming up the hillside. It's not exactly like you're going to take me by surprise, per se. And so whether or not they were aware of it, maybe Jesus had taken them far enough in that they didn't have direct sight of what was going on. Jesus seems to be trying to protect them. He doesn't want them to be injured. And so we're told that Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Who seek ye? And so Jesus made it a point before his disciples had an opportunity to approach or be approached, that he presented himself to them. He knew what they were there for, and he was trying at best to reduce the conflict. Does anybody have any questions or comments down through that? And of course, he asked, Whom seek ye? He knew who they were looking for, but again, they answered Jesus of Nazareth, and of course he tells them that I am he. And Judas also, which was there, stood with them. We find in other passages, of course, Judas came up to Jesus and gave him a kiss. I mean, John doesn't go into a great deal about that here, but he does say that Judas was there. And of course, we can read about that. What's interesting to me is that as soon as Jesus said, I am he identifies himself, these people take a step back and they kind of fall down or kneel down to the ground. This again is part of the evidence that we have. There were many people who believed on Jesus and believed in his powers and what he was capable of doing, and even those who were sent to arrest him, instead of just, for lack of a better word, just jumping him. I mean, if I'm he, why didn't the band just jump on top of him, wrestle him to the ground? But there is still, I'm sure lots of people have different opinions, but to me, there just still is a certain degree of we would really not, we really would prefer not to do this, or we really, it's one of those things. We're just doing our duty. We've been told that we have to do this, and so again, Jesus speaks to them, "Whom seek ye?" And they repeat again, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said, "I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way." They didn't say that they were looking for Jesus and his disciples. They just said that they were looking for Jesus. And so Jesus said, if that's who you're looking for, I'm he. I told you that's me. There's no reason that these others can't go their way. And so Jesus wanted them really to leave. Sometimes we read in some of the other accounts that, in the skirmish and all, some ran away. One's even said they tried to grab him and they basically tore his cloak off, and he went off into the night without much or any clothing. And so, that, and again, the fulfillment of that saying might be fulfilled, which he spake of them, which thou gavest me, have I lost none. Save, of course, the son of perdition, and we've already talked about that. But at this point, all is well, and Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. It was pretty much a common thing for people to carry a stick, what we today call a walking stick. They would carry that for various purposes, for defense, something to lean on to assist them going up and down the hill. We've talked about that. But it wasn't unheard of that they would also carry a sword or a knife or whatever with them for various purposes. And so Peter had one, and having it doesn't do any good in the sheath. So Peter, I would expect him to be the one who, having a sword, pulled it out. I would expect him to be one of the first ones that would try to come to Jesus' assistance. And I have always said this, or mostly said it since I really thought about it much. He had a sword and he cut off the right ear of the servant of the high priest, which was Malchus. I have and still continue to believe it was not Peter's intention to cut his right ear off. I believe it was Peter's intention to split his skull wide open. But like most people, if you see somebody who has a sword and swinging it in your direction, you're going to flinch, you're going to move. And so rather than hitting him right square in the top of the head, he took his ear off. Yes.
They don't mention they had at that time, both sides were sharp.
Yeah.
Two-edged.
Yeah, a two-edged sword. So again,
You get it either way.
yeah, I mean, the purpose of that was to be able, when you swung it one direction, you could swing it another. I don't know if he turned. I don't know if he was swinging down. We don't really get the whole gist of it, but he didn't quite get away from Peter anyway. And so he took off his ear, and Jesus told Peter, "Put up thy sword into the sheath." And this is where he mentions again, "The cup which the Father hath given me, shall I not drink it?" Peter had heard, and John had heard, and James had heard Jesus praying about, "If it be thy will, let this cup pass from me." And so with these individuals there, it's apparent that, he couldn't allow that to pass. And so, he says, it's clear that it's the Father's will that this must be. And so if it's the Father's will and he sent me to do this, he gave me this cup of suffering and sorrow to drink, and so I must drink it. The crucifixion, the suffering, all of that. And so then we're told that the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. And of course, the Romans took away the lifetime high priest office and substituted a rotating high priest office that lasted, I think, about a year. But the Jews, in their own way, even though the Romans appointed a different high priest each year, the Jews also honored the true high priest. And so they went through the formalities to make the Romans happy with the appointed high priest of the Romans, but they also had their own high priest, which was there for life, and they took him there. And so that tells us that it was the Sanhedrin, the high priests, those who were in charge, that had set this wheel in motion. And it is the same one that had mentioned that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, when he said that, his opinion was, as we recall, that if they left him alone, the Romans were going to come and take away their place in nation. And so in their view, the best way to keep everything the way it was to let Jesus die. But even in that prophecy, there is truth. Jesus wasn't dying, though, so Caiaphas and the rest of these could keep their little program going. But it was part of the plan of God that he was dying for the people, but not for them as they thought. And so with his death, and Paul even said, had the rulers of this world known, they would have not crucified Jesus, because that literally was the beginning of the end for Satan and his power, delivering those who a lifetime had been subject to bondage and were held in the Hadean world until the forgiveness of sins was made possible. And so here again we see that that sacrifice was, and Jesus was willing to make that sacrifice. Anyone have any comments or questions or anything down through?
Well, the particular reason why that servant's name was mentioned, because it's only mentioned there one time.
John, the Apostle John, was familiar with the high priest's family. Yeah. And he had access into the house that night Jesus was arrested. The servants allowed him to come and go. So he had a friendly relationship with the high priest and those I don't know if he was of the tribe of Levi. I don't know, but he had a friendly relationship, and so he may very well have known this individual personally. Wouldn't necessarily know everybody's name, but since John, this is a servant of the high priest, and since John seemed to have a very familiar relationship with them, that he could just walk in to the building while Jesus was there and being tried and all that. The likelihood, I mean, that's my explanation is that John had seen him before. He may very well have known him, and he knew him well enough to be able to call him by name. He doesn't just call him the servant of the high priest. I've seen him hanging around, but he calls him by name, which implies that he had a halfway decent familiarity, at least, with him.
Now, in 1826, I think, I don't know if it's when they're questioning Peter about Jesus or not, but in 1826, he says, one of the servants of the high priest, being kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, "No, I see thee in the garden." I guess that's when he denies Christ
Yeah.
one time.
Yeah, that's when he was outside warming himself by the fire.
Yeah.
And, they take him there. And as we study deeper, we find that John was there. And when this damsel comes to Peter and is asking for him from the other writers, and our time's about up, but we see that John asked her to go get Peter. Mm-hmm. So John was in the house, and he asked one of the damsels, the young girls who was working, we might think of them sort of as a maid or servant, to go get Peter because he was still outside. Well, Peter misunderstands. John's trying to get him in the building. And when the girl comes, she just asks him, "Are you Peter? Are you Peter who's a disciple of Christ?" And of course, he panics because he thinks that, they're out to get him. And no. And so she keeps trying, and they keep trying to find him. And the other people even, again, your language, your accent, your tongue betrays you. You're one of the Galileans that was with him. And even said that, I had seen him there that night, one of those who was warming by the fire. Didn't I see you there? And so it's an interesting, we'll get into some of that. Hang on to that question, and we'll pick that up next week. Anything else?
I noticed he didn't introduce himself. Jesus didn't. I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm introducing you.
Yeah, again, I'm sure they probably knew who he was or could have known. Of course, at night, you want to be sure. Many times they were wearing their outer garment. It kind of it could flip up as a hood if it was cold. They may have had hats and things on, so it may be a little more difficult to identify.
They got a cut nail on,
Yeah,
or making it look like the Romans.